Welcome to Hudson RPO's podcast on racial equality and diversity. Hear from Hudson RPO leaders as they encourage organizations to just start on their D&I journey.
Hey guys, I am back with Mark Rogers, Casey Butler, Gary Jones, back on our Just Start web series / podcast. So wanted to just circle back to what we were talking about last time, which is the topic of sourcing and our perspective that if you're trying to make an impact in the diversity and equity and inclusion space, that sourcing oftentimes is the first port of call and maybe not appropriately so. So it's been a good time talking about that, but wanted to carry that conversation forward and talk about some other questions, suggestions that I feel like we and our teams are all hearing from clients, and just get your thoughts on, these tactics and what you say to clients who ask you about them. So one sort of hot topic is this idea of blind resume submission. Just for context, it's a very famous article in the New York Times, or I think it was actually a Harvard Business School study about a symphony orchestra, and this idea that if you put people behind a curtain, you got better, more diverse outcomes because you're really just assessing the tone quality of the instrument and not taking into account the visual factors of who is performing the instrument. And so, people had this idea of like, well, let's translate that into a business context. And should we just erase any personally identifying information from the resume and assess those candidates strictly on the theoretical merit of their resume? So I know I've been asked about that a number of times from a number of different quarters. Curious if anyone else has as well, and what your thoughts are about that.
Go ahead, Gary. If you've been asked about it, I've had conversations about it, but they've not gone far. So I'll tell you what I think about it, and then anyone who's been asked about it, just chime in. I think there are certain things that in this space, if they're not, the blind resumes is definitely an outcome change, but it's not necessarily a behavioral change. I'm all for, initiatives in the DEI space that change behavior. And I think that the blind resume submission piece, while again, it could potentially positively impact the outcome, although there's obviously varying opinions on whether it ultimately does or doesn't. I think you're better suited focusing on initiatives that change outcomes, that build accountability, that create awareness, and that influence change, as opposed to simply kind of, hey, let's sweep it under, kind of the proverbial rug and, kind of remove awareness from the equation. So I think in theory, it I suppose it could work. We've had conversations about it, but ultimately, when I think about all the things you can be doing, that's probably my least favorite of all the things that gets thrown out there pretty frequently. But Gary, what do you think? And you're on mute.
Yeah, I'm off mute now. I think, thanks, Mark. I would agree with you. I think that maybe it's not as much of a behavior change. Maybe it's a good lesson. Maybe it's an exercise to get the juices flowing, to look at the practice of really being equitable when you review resumes. I don't know if it's a replacement for your recruiters or hiring managers, folks who are making those decisions. I don't know if it's a replacement for that. I do think that overall you want a behavior change. You want people to understand why we're doing this. So I think it may start there, but probably not something long-term that I would suggest with my teams. I don't know about you, Casey, in terms of your thoughts.
Yeah, I was just going to say the same thing. I think it's really about, training our managers about bias, right? I think that comes down to it. If you remove the name and, other things, there are other factors on their resume that they may be biased about anyways.
Right.
If they see the name of the university. Oh no, I had a candidate from that university last time and, they weren't successful. So I think, if you remove the name, people will just find people who are biased are just going to find other areas to be able to apply their bias. So
That's
I think
a fantastic point.
Yeah.
That truly is. Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's just important that, I think it could be a tool to kind of show people how their biases may be impacted, but I think it's really about teaching them about bias. I think that's the number one factor when it comes to that.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So what I hear from that is like it lacks the element of people taking accountability for their own biases, right? Like it tries to sort of push forward without doing that work first. So that's the first thing. The other thing that I just to layer onto that that I've sort of challenged folks about is this idea that merit in a resume is as objective as tone quality in an instrument, right? Like I think we can reasonably agree that like the quality of sound from a violin can have some objective measurements, but if we erase all measures of identity from somebody's resume, are we really considering that from person A to get from their life circumstances to a corporate internship versus person B to get from their life circumstances to a corporate internship could look very different. One could have everything handed to them and the other has to really scrap and fight for that. And are we erasing that element of it if we are erasing all elements of identity and anything related to their background or their education or whatever else from those resumes? So I guess to just close on this piece, I tend to challenge folks like we should be taking into account the totality of the person when we're assessing them for their suitability for the role, and we should be considering their differences and what's different and diverse in their background and not trying to erase that. So, but again, to all points, like I understand how it can have some sort of near-term benefit, but I think again it sort of fundamentally doesn't address some of the systemic factors that drive differences in resume merit, as it were. Okay, so round robin style. So next up actually is this idea of diverse shortlists and having some sort of targeted numbers in terms of what the demographic profile is, or some minimum numbers rather, because we don't talk about quotas if we're talking about specific percentages, but there's a lot of minimums, right? At least one or at least two or whatever other measurements have prevailed in this space. So curious if any of you had been asked about that and what your thoughts are about sort of shortlist minimums.
So I'm based in Canada. Just I don't know if everyone knows that, but so it's slightly different here when it comes to minimums. When it comes to, if you've got a contract with the government in the US, you have specific guidelines that you need to follow. It's slightly different here. There are more recommendations than they are, requirements. So I'd sort of really love to kind of hand that over to either you, Mark, or Gary to kind of comment a little bit more, because it is very different between the two countries in this regard.
Yeah, I think it's tough because it's not a one size fits all, right? So the demographics of a certain position or a certain geographic location, those types of things differ from position to position. So I've seen where people will blanketly state, hey, we need a minimum of this many number of diverse candidates for all their roles without even really looking at what the talent pool actually bears, for those particular environments. So again, I don't, me personally, I don't like the minimums. I don't like that. I really like, again, looking at talent, really making sure that we're considering talent from every angle possible and making an informed decision based on that, knowing that we have committed to making sure that we have a diverse environment. So again, it differs from position to position, geography to geography. So creating minimums, I think, can be a really tough task when you're trying to do that from the outset. I don't know about you, Mark.
Yeah. This is one of the easy ones, right? And that's why it's always like one of the top three things that that companies say that they want to do. Let's put minimums, requirements in there for a slate of one female or one person of color on the slate. And sure, that may get you increased candidate flow of whatever the particular demographic is, but what is the impact hiring? And if you continue to do presumably what your organization has done, and that's not hire people of color, but interview and bring in for the last round of interviews, what exactly are you accomplishing in that? I just think it's one of the easier things to do. I think a lot of the things that are more impactful or longer term, like, do you really want to focus on this, or do you want to focus more on increasing the amount of diverse talent into the applicant pool? And that's through multiple sources, whether you're posting your job on diverse websites or with diverse partners, Are you attending events? Are you engaging with HBCUs and other things like that? But yeah, this one to me is an easy one that that doesn't always net you the results that you want or you think it will.
I know when our clients ask, my recruiters, this type of question, that's, Mark, some of the things you've described there, are some of the things that I recommend, when we're having these conversations with the client. And that is, let's look at our sourcing channels. Let's look, let's make relationships. Let's create relationships with, diverse groups, so that when we have roles, we can make sure that they're being seen by everybody, and accessible to those individuals. So I think, that was a great comment about the different sources.
Yeah.
And it does
So what do
feel
you
like
do?
it feels like a quota, right? I mean, it
Yeah,
feels like
absolutely.
a quota. And if you, even if best case scenario, you hire the talent that you're bringing in based on whatever those minimum slate requirements are, if you haven't addressed your internal, organization internally, your culture, do you have development programs in place? Do you have mentors and things like that? You're just flooding the pipeline with talent that will exit the organization and take with it an impression of your brand that they will no doubt share.
Yeah, and even if they aren't selected, right, and you still have that systemic issue, or you're not addressing, anyway, the behavior trains, but yet you are, you're adding diverse candidates to a slate, and the candidate experience for those diverse candidates can come back and backfire if you're not fixing the right issue, right? So it's a good point all the way around.
So just to close out on this one, it's actually a good transition into our next one. But I think what's common between all three of the questions that I'm posing today is they're all sort of driven by Harvard Business Review studies that seem to sort of get picked up and get implemented into companies because everyone is looking for that sort of quick fix silver bullet option. And good big name in Harvard Business Review, and obviously there's data behind it. But actually around this one in specific, even the Harvard Business Review data says that unless those minimums are actually quite large, or at least more than two, they have no impact. And in fact, people view those people as being the diversity candidate on their short list that they have to interview as a matter of course, versus being a number of different diverse candidates that are part of an overall slate and are, as qualified as anyone else. So there's also just sort of that poor optics to it, and it's ineffective unless there is a critical mass of people of diverse backgrounds on that short list. So I said that there's a third one that's driven by Harvard Business Review data, and that's this idea of diverse interview panels. And again, the data is good, right? If you have diverse interviewers in the interview process, diverse candidates are more likely to get hired, which is good and great, and that's what we're all trying to work towards. And it does focus on those outcomes in terms of the candidate experience. But what I struggle with is the employee experience of being one of those diverse interviewers, particularly in organizations that struggle with their current demographic profile. Is that desirable, and is that possible without eventually tokenizing or putting a lot of this office housework onto women and people of color to be those quote unquote diverse interviewers? Thoughts on this panel?
So it's funny. So basically, we're summarizing by saying our internal selection team, whatever it may be, hiring managers, talent acquisition, HR, whoever it may be, are mostly white, hiring non-diverse candidates. So in order for us to fix the problem, we're going to have diverse candidates hire diverse candidates, right? So to me, that's not necessarily teaching anyone, what diversity really means and what you're trying to do. I think that everyone should carry the torch. They should understand what diversity means. You don't have to be diverse to understand diverse. And honestly, again, everything that we've talked about up to this point is a behavior change. And what we're trying to do is really constitute a really genuine behavior change. And if we continue to push it off on diverse people to solve a diverse problem, the problem will never be solved, and it won't be a behavior change across the board. So that's my thoughts. I don't know if the panel has other thoughts around it.
Casey, yep.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think, you want your panel to represent your population too. And if your population isn't diverse, it's almost a little bit like false advertising. I feel like for the candidate, it's like you're putting your best foot forward, but it's not honest. And so if you're not honest with your candidates, and we've talked about this on the last podcast, not just your diverse candidates, but your non-diverse candidates as well. I mean, it should be a conversation about diversity for both of those types of candidates, not just the diverse ones. But yeah, I think it's a little bit of false advertising if that's not really what your organization, that doesn't really represent your organization.
Yeah, so I mostly agree. And I just want to be careful when we say diverse and non-diverse. I mean, I think typically we're probably talking about either women or people of color, and then
Yes, thank you.
that kind of thing. So I want to be clear about that. But
Yeah.
Look, I think it just depends on how the diverse employees are used in the process. I absolutely agree. If you don't have the critical mass, it really becomes a bit cumbersome to be a person of color who's always the person that's inserted into the process and forced to kind of carry the torch that you spoke about. I do think, though, if you have the ability to obviously have a diverse panel, you should endeavor to have that. But I think it's also important that in having that panel, you have the diverse representation, have the ability to have a voice in the decision, of course, to be a part of the debrief discussion and to offer their input, and to do that in a way that they don't feel uncomfortable with doing so. So I generally agree, but I do think it's something that, as an employer, you should endeavor to, have a diverse panel. But everything that we've said about kind of the easy things to do, like, again, this is another one that if you've got the person of color, the black, hey, let's bring a black guy in so, we can have him talk to the African-American, candidate and have that candidate feel comfortable with, the company and the makeup of the company and speak for, that segment. So I think it can be a little disingenuous sometimes, but it's something that you should endeavor to have in place, and just depending on how that person is engaged in the process, and they, to Gary's point, can't be the torchbearer for the whole thing. It's just not going to, like most of these things, it's not going to net the results that you think it will, and it presents that disingenuous look that Casey talked about.
I think Jerry made a good point on the candidate side. I think in this particular instance, on the interviewer side, it's the same thing. You're bringing in this interviewer and they're being looked at as, okay, this is the one, right, that is going to choose the diverse candidate. And that's not always true. Like you said, women of color, women or people of color, excuse me. So it's going to be key how that's brought in, the communication and how it's aligned. And again, I hate to be a broken record. It's a behavior. Everyone has to buy into it. So, and I think you alluded to it too, Mark, is that if that is one of the steps toward it, everyone has to be 100% engaged and inclusive and collaborative inside of it, and not necessarily have this person be a one-off or, like you said, feel awkward for their decisions or their opinions. So.
Yeah, I'm curious, has anybody seen that, like, work in good practice where you've got this diverse panel that not only participates in the interview, but comes together in a debrief session and has a really meaningful, robust conversation with that person providing the kind of input that you would expect in the process?
I actually have.
It just been typically, have you?
I actually have. Maybe this is, but it's not, it required a lot of effort. And it's actually one of the things that we talk about a lot, like how to recreate that in the day-to-day, because the context in which we saw this, Mark, was in a sort of bulk hiring effort, right? Like where there was a lot of effort around hiring a lot of people. Diversity was absolutely one of the pillars of the strategy and the approach. There was a really structured process that included an interview, a debrief with the full hiring panel, with people empowered to talk about diversity at the end. And damn it if that didn't work. And I can point to specific outcomes that would have been different if there wasn't one voice in the room that was really an advocate for that individual.
That's great.
And it worked great. It really did. I'm now a believer it works. The difficulty is, how do you reproduce that on the day-to-day? How do you take the situation where you just got to roll here, roll there? This hiring manager is not linked to this hiring manager. They just want to get their things as quick as possible. They're not willing to make the time to dedicate to that kind of focused and structured effort. I think that's what we're talking about here, is that actually requires a lot of work on the part of the hiring business, the hiring team, the hiring manager. And it isn't a quick fix approach. It isn't, based on the number of candidates on the short list. It's not based on some magical composition of the interview panel. It's based on them putting in the effort, making the time, and really giving a concerted focus to this. And unless and until people are willing to do that, then we're just sort of tinkering around the margins. And I think that's what I'm hearing from this panel today. So again, just for listeners, it's not that you shouldn't do any of these things or all of these things. It's just that they're not enough. And I think that's what we'll continue to talk about in this forum. How do we start to get that buy-in and change those behaviors and sustain those behaviors? So a topic for another day, but I enjoyed this conversation as always. Thanks again, Mark Rogers, Casey Butler, Gary Jones. See you next time.
Thanks,
guys.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
To speak with any of today's participants about your Just Start journey, email juststart@hudsonrpo.com.